and Ronald Reagan for John Lennon's murder, Richard Nixon is already dead. Contrary to reports you may have seen in the media about me being a stalker of Stephen King, contrary to reports that there's a restraining order against me, those are all false. I'm not a stalker. There's no restraining order against me by Stephen King. The media is lying about me. I have evidence, namely coded information in back issues of Time and Newsweek issues surrounding the night of John Lennon's murder, that prove Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan let none other than the famous author Stephen King assassinate John Lennon, his opposite. And then they have a lookalike named Mark David Chapman, who they paid to take the blame and lead the public astray. I discovered this by accident in July of 1982 when I went to the San Jose branch of the Pacific Beach Library, or I should say the Pacific Beach branch of the San Diego Library, looking for the murder story to find out why Mark David Chapman never went to trial, why he was allowed to plead guilty not 6 months after the murder like the media says, but a year and 6 months after the after the murder. I stumbled onto a bunch of strange behavior in the bold print headlines of Time and Newsweek. Headlines like All the President's Magazines, A Bombshell Case Goes Poofed, Camp David Double Talk, Murder at the Met by a Phantom Killer, Death Trail, Death Comes from the Prime Minister, A Gambler's Luck Runs Out, Unholy Ministry, Defiant Widow in the Dock. When I got to this headline, Who's In, Who's Out, above newly elected Reagan, I thought, what's going on in the headlines here? What are these, cryptography and the bold print all about John Lennon's murder in Time magazine? Because Reagan was just elected and John Lennon was just shot. The interpretation in my mind went, Reagan's in, Lennon's out? And then I took a closer look at the photo, and there's Richard Nixon's book, The Real War, sitting next to Reagan. I remembered Richard Nixon tried to deport John Lennon, so when I saw the smaller headline, fitting together the pieces of a complicated jigsaw puzzle, I decided to look up The Real War, and I found passages like this. Unfortunately, America is still suffering from the legacy of the 1960s. The Nixon Doctrine. It makes no sense to use a sledgehammer to kill a fly. That kind of enemy calls for a less powerful but more effective weapon, a fly swatter. But too many of America's intellectual and cultural elite have shown themselves to be brilliant, creative, trendy, gullible, smug, and blind in one eye. They see bad only on the right and not on the left. War is bad and peace is good, and posturing with words is everything. Those who manipulate the symbols, who decide what the nations or leaders will be depicted as good or bad. I remembered how Richard Nixon was derided as Tricky Dicky in Lennon's songs, and how Nixon was naked dancing with Sherman Mao on one of Lennon's albums, and other songs about Richard Nixon. If America loses World War III, it will be because of the attention, the celebrity, and the legitimacy given to the trendies. Those over-glamorized dilettantes who posture the latest idea, mount the fashionable protests, and are slobbered over by the news media, whose cause they embrace with their anti-war, anti-nuclear, anti-military, anti-business. It is almost invariably one that works against the interest of the U.S. in the context of World War III. These trendies are ready with an opinion at the drop of a microphone, and their opinions are treated as news not because they are authorities, but because they are celebrities. In a less hazardous age, we could afford to indulge the prancing of the trendies on the stage of public debate. But now we must learn to distinguish between the meaningful and the meaningless. The war in Vietnam was lost in the drawing rooms of the beautiful people of New York. Perhaps a nation that equates celebrity with the wisdom and looks to rock stars as his oracles deserves to lose. World Wars I and II were not Woodstocks. It is precisely because so many have transposed the points that the light of reason has dimmed and a dangerous confusion has spread. Ending that confusion is the first step towards seeing the path to victory. All that was in Richard Nixon's book, which is incidentally also in Newsweek the same day of the murder next to Reagan. A week before the murder, in the December 8th, 1980 issue of Newsweek, I found this consecutive string of bold print codes. Odd men out, bad blood, the Nixon factor, stay tuned, intensity. And in the subcontext of the article, he abruptly withdrew into rising enemy fire. Bit of a prima donna with a brilliant mind and an abrasive manner. After he was shot down, he took himself out, found himself caught in the crossfire of Washington politics and in the bag races of Richard Nixon. He intimidated some of the elders with his brash brilliance. I found other headlines for a period of only 5 months surrounding the murder that plug into John Lennon's assassination. Headlines like, all the president's magazines, Poet of Pity and Anger, Caught in the Crossfire, Johnny Comes Marching Home, The Real John Lennon, Thinking About John Lennon, The Right to Bear Arms, The Days Dwindled Down, Le Monde Under Attack, Kiss Kiss Bang Bang Ouch Ouch, The Wheels Are Spinning, Ample Penalty, Poet of Pity and Anger, America Needs a Poet Laureate Maybe, etc., etc. I realized, my God, I have actually found codes in the bold print of Time and Newsweek all about John Lennon's murder. I moved up north to where I was raised for fear of my life, and then, months later, I found the name of the alleged killer, Mark David King Chapman, 3 weeks before the murder in U.S. News and World Report, where he says, like millions of volunteers in the armed forces, I'm a pawn waiting for some giant hand to move me into some hostile square. How uncomfortable a soldier can feel when he finds out that the hand belongs to Ronald Reagan. The last thing I found, the very last thing I found, because the codes only last for about 5 months, 3 months before the murder, the killer's face and true identity, Stephen King, advertised one great big Zippo lighter, which describes the scene of the crime of a man at night with a gun on fire. And I found his face a month later with a new haircut, hiding his face, advertised Perils of Pyrokinesis, which means perils of fire and movement. And the book about fire starters says, King dubbed this inflammatory fort pyrokinesis, a combination of the Greek words meaning fire and movement. As a result of a government-sponsored experiment, he is addicted to such objurgations as, quote, you blind, obsessive fools, end quote. Stephen King is a superb plotter with a fine eye for terrain and indeed pyrotechnical detail. I read more of his books and realized, indeed, he not only writes about John Lennon's killer in 3 books, he writes about shooting a man in the shoulder blades, he writes about getting a man's autograph before trying to kill him, he writes about stalking a celebrity before he changes the world. He writes, for example, a patch between his shoulder blades began to itch insanely. That's where he's going to put it, he thought, right between the shoulder blade. God had put his mark on my Johnny, and I rejoice. The killer was slick. He sat on the bench in the town bar humming a song from the Beatles album back in the USSR. He wasn't a killer yet. Yes, I saw the Newsweek article. That picture of me is for the press conference, only cropped. Don't look like anyone you'd like to meet in a dark alley, do I? Which is where Lennon was shot, and his face was cropped. The man who took this photograph, Paul Goresh, broke into Lennon's apartment, posing as a VCR repairman. As if this evidence was not enough, when I went to Stephen King's hometown in 1992, he had a friend drop off a book called Let Me Take You Down about Mark Chapman through my window. And on the inside flap is a letter, Dear Steve, blah, 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 I didn't kill John Lennon. Meantime, here's a fascinating book about the man who really did kill John Best, Stephen King. The Freudian slip is, he signed his name to me, his accuser, the man who really did kill John Best, Stephen King. And in that book, there's a bookmarker at this section where the book reads, standing beside Lennon getting the album signed. I'll give you anything for that picture, Chapman said, anything. I'll give you $50 for that one picture. Meet me here tomorrow and I'll give you $50 for that picture, me with John Lennon, if it comes out all right. Is that a deal? I took this as a veiled bribe because there's also a smudge mark right next to the paragraph. But the big scoop on this is 8 years before I got this letter under the name Dennis C. Lee, but it's Stephen King's handwriting. The as match, the scrawl matches exactly. He says 8 years back in 1984, right before my dad died in a plane crash, Stephen Lightfoot, you haven't got the whole story yet, but since you will not cease your investigation, I thought I may as well clue you to Phase 3. Suspected undercover punks are kicking my van and threatening to break my windows, stealing my car keys, and suddenly the police are in my face as if they know what the government has in mind for me. So I urge you people to pull your head out of the sand, stop exposing your rear end to the government, give a damn, respect yourselves, find out who really did kill John Lennon. You never saw a trial for Mark Chapman. The real killer is helping the world order molest your children and make them perverted.